A flight attendant stabbed a black teen's hand with a fork until blood spilled across the seats. Seconds later, the CEO rammed that same fork into the attendant's neck. What happens next will leave you speechless. He jabbed a fork into a baby's tiny hand, certain his uniform would protect him. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The turbulence began with a sudden shudder that rippled through the cabin, jolting trays, rattling glasses, and drawing startled gasps from a few passengers. Ethan Carraway steadied himself with one hand against the armrest, the other tightening protectively around his infant son, Oliver, who whimpered in confusion at the abrupt shift. The overhead lights flickered for a brief second before steadying, but the unease in the cabin did not fade. Ethan leaned forward slightly, murmuring in a calm, even tone, "It's all right, Oliver. Just the sky testing us." His voice was steady, deliberate. He was a man used to projecting calm in stormy boardrooms, though here it was his child who needed assurance, not a table of shareholders. As he rocked the baby gently, Ethan's sharp eyes caught the figure of Rowan Maddox moving down the aisle. The senior attendant's stride was brisk, almost cutting, as though every step were a judgment against those seated before him. His uniform was pressed and gleaming, but his face carried an unmistakable scowl. The corners of his lips tightened in irritation that never quite faded. Rowan's gaze swept over passengers in quick, dismissive glances, yet when his eyes landed on Ethan and Oliver, they lingered. Too long, too pointed. Ethan noticed the way Rowan's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of disdain thinly veiled beneath professional decorum. Ethan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the small toy he dangled in front of Oliver, a bright rattle that chimed with each gentle shake. The sound seemed to soothe the child for a moment, but it did little to soften the atmosphere pressing in around them. Rowan paused a row ahead, helping a passenger adjust a bag in the overhead compartment, yet even as he offered assistance, the sharpness in his gestures betrayed irritation. His words were clipped, his tone cold, and the passenger shrank back into his seat with a hurried thank you. The CAO's instincts were rarely wrong, and they whispered now that this man, this Rowan, was not merely strict or tired. There was a current beneath his movements, a hostility he struggled to keep contained. Ethan's mind flicked through possibilities. Stress, personal troubles, a long day. Yet as Rowan's eyes darted back again, holding on Oliver's small frame with something more than idle curiosity, Ethan felt a tension coil in his chest. He frowned, stroking the baby's back, telling himself it was nothing. But others had noticed, too. The younger attendants who moved about the cabin kept their distance from Rowan, like small fish steering clear of a predator. One carried a tray of water glasses, and when Rowan brushed past him, the boy nearly dropped it, his hands trembling as he murmured an apology. Rowan did not even look at him, only muttered something sharp under his breath before continuing forward. The moment was small, fleeting, but to Ethan it confirmed what his instincts had already warned him. This was a man others feared, though no one spoke of it aloud. Oliver began to squirm again, his face pinching as the turbulence rattled the plane once more. His fists clenched, tiny knuckles pale, and a thin cry rose from his throat. Ethan gently rocked him, whispering words of comfort, but he could feel the child's tension growing. The cabin was too loud, too unstable, too heavy with unease. The baby's cry cut through the hum of engines, drawing a few glances from nearby passengers. Most smiled sympathetically, but Ethan saw Rowan's eyes narrow like a hawk circling prey. For a moment, their gazes locked. Rowan's expression was unreadable, but there was no warmth, no understanding, only the faint curl of a smirk that seemed out of place in the sterile calm of the cabin. Ethan straightened his shoulders, shifting Oliver closer to his chest, as though shielding him from something unseen. The baby's cry softened under his father's steady hand, but Ethan's mind raced. He had led companies through hostile takeovers, navigated crises with millions at stake, but this was different. This was personal, intimate, raw, and it was unfolding not in a boardroom, but 30,000 feet above the ground with nowhere to retreat. The lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered a stretch of heavier turbulence, casting shadows across the rows of uneasy passengers. Some whispered to each other, others closed their eyes tightly, muttering quiet prayers. Ethan focused on Oliver, keeping his breathing steady, though every instinct told him that the storm in the sky was not the only one he needed to brace against. Rowan's steps echoed faintly in the aisle, the sound carrying with it a warning Ethan could not yet decipher. The CEO's mind, so often disciplined, felt a flicker of unease. Was this nothing more than a surly attendant, weary from years of service? Or was there something festering deeper, a malice that had yet to reveal its true face? His grip tightened around Oliver, protective, unyielding. The cabin shuddered once more, and the rattle slipped from his hand, bouncing lightly against the seat before rolling out into the aisle. Ethan leaned to retrieve it, but froze when he saw Rowan's polished shoe halt the toy in its path. The attendant bent down slowly, picking it up, and when he returned it to Ethan, his fingers lingered a moment too long on the plastic handle, his eyes locked in a stare that carried no kindness. "Careful," Rowan said quietly, his voice smooth but laced with something sharper beneath. "You wouldn't want to lose hold of what matters most." He placed the toy in Ethan's hand and stepped back, continuing down the aisle as though nothing had passed. Ethan's jaw tightened. His instincts screamed louder now, though he forced his expression into calm neutrality. He looked at Oliver, still whimpering softly, and kissed the baby's head, whispering, "I won't let anything happen to you." The rattle chimed faintly in his hand, a fragile sound against the steady hum of the engines. Yet it felt less like comfort now and more like a warning bell, echoing in the space between father and son. Ethan settled back in his seat, eyes tracking Rowan as the man disappeared into the galley, the shadow of his smirk lingering like smoke in the air. The turbulence eased, but the tension remained, thick and unspoken. Ethan stared at the seat back before him, his mind alive with unease, his heart steady with resolve. He had no proof, no reason to act, yet every fiber of his being told him this flight was not what it seemed. And though Oliver had quieted against his chest, Ethan knew the silence was deceptive. It was not peace, but the moment before eruption. Sometimes silence is only the breath before the storm. The fork came down without warning, the gleam of silver catching the dim cabin light as it pierced the soft flesh of Oliver's tiny hand. A sound split the air, high, raw, and heartbreaking. The baby's scream was sharp enough to silence the hum of engines, sharp enough to pull every gaze in the cabin toward the scene. Blood welled instantly, thin crimson lines staining the pale skin before dripping in startling contrast against the white fabric of the seat. For a frozen second, no one moved. The world seemed to hang in suspension, a single act of cruelty anchoring everyone in disbelief. Ethan's arms convulsed around his son, instinct forcing him to tighten his hold as if he could shield Oliver from pain already delivered. His mind refused to accept what his eyes had seen. A fork. His son. Blood. The pieces didn't belong in the same thought, yet there they were, bound together in a grotesque reality. His chest burned with the weight of a scream he did not release. Rowan Maddox loomed above them, his face carved with satisfaction. His lips curled into a sneer as he lifted the fork back into view, Oliver's blood glinting along its tines. To him, it wasn't a utensil. It was a trophy, proof of power and dominance over the helpless. The cruel gleam in his eyes made the moment more unbearable than the injury itself. Passengers gasped. A man in the back row clutched his armrest, his knuckles whitening. Another pressed a hand to his mouth as though suppressing nausea. A young boy peeked over his father's shoulder before being pulled back, shielded from the sight. Yet none moved to intervene. The air was heavy with fear, the silence thick and suffocating, as though Rowan's cruelty had paralyzed the entire cabin. "Stop this." Ethan's voice cracked through the silence, raw and filled with fury. His face was flushed, veins straining at his temples, but his voice carried the strength of a man who could not, would not, yield. Rowan only smirked, tilting the fork so that the overhead light caught the red stains more vividly. "Your silence feeds me," Rowan hissed, his voice low but clear enough to reach the surrounding seats. His tone was not one of remorse but of mockery, as though this moment were a performance designed for an audience. His hand trembled slightly, not from guilt but from the thrill of what he had done. Ethan's heart thundered, each beat a drum of rage and disbelief. He rocked Oliver against his chest, whispering, "I've got you. I've got you, son." His words shaking but firm. The baby's cries tore at him, every wail a blade cutting deeper into his resolve. The smell of blood mingled with recycled cabin air, an unnatural reminder of how far from safety they were. The attendants around them faltered, their faces pale. One young steward opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, his eyes darting between Rowan's raised fork and the screaming child. The others avoided Ethan's gaze entirely, their training overridden by fear. Rowan's reputation had always shadowed their duties, and in this moment it held them hostage. Ethan's disbelief shifted into something darker. Rage surged, flooding through every nerve, stripping away the careful patience that years of boardrooms and negotiations had taught him. This was no business dispute, no polite disagreement. This was blood, his son's blood, spilled by a man in uniform who wore arrogance like armor. He lunged. The movement was instinctive, primal. The aisle wall rattled as Ethan slammed Rowan back against it, the impact drawing gasps from the passengers once again. Rowan staggered but refused to drop the fork. His sneer twisted into a grin, as though he had expected this, as though he had wanted it. "You'll only damn yourself," Rowan taunted, his voice strained but laced with perverse delight. He pressed the fork tighter in his hand, brandishing it not toward Ethan but toward the onlookers, daring them to interfere. Ethan's chest heaved, his breath harsh and uneven, but his voice carried an unshakable command. "No one touches him." No one. His glare swept over the attendants, forcing them into stillness. His authority was not corporate now, it was born of blood and fury, undeniable and immovable. The moment stretched, every second a battle between restraint and violence. Oliver's sobs softened to whimpers, but each sound was a reminder that the battle had already begun. Ethan's arms tightened protectively around him, the warmth of his small body anchoring him to purpose. And still, Rowan's eyes gleamed with something beyond malice. They gleamed with knowledge, with secrets too large to be contained in one violent act. He leaned forward, bloodied fork raised high, but the tremor in his body betrayed his weakness. His lips curled once more into that unbearable smile. Ethan saw it clearly now. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was a message. Rowan had chosen Oliver not at random, but with intent. Not for harm alone, but for something more sinister. The truth of that intent hovered just out of reach, waiting to be revealed. The cabin, once filled with the steady hum of a routine flight, now felt like a chamber of judgment, every eye locked on Ethan and Rowan. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, too afraid to speak aloud, too horrified to look away. The weight of expectation pressed against Ethan's back. He knew there was no returning to silence, no return to peace. His objective crystallized with terrifying clarity. There was no negotiation left, no space for mercy. Protect Oliver. Stop Rowan. Ensure this cruelty never touched his son again. And as Ethan tightened his grip, preparing for whatever came next, the truth of the moment seared itself into the cabin's silence. In that moment, mercy burned away, leaving only fury. Rowan's cry split the tense air as Ethan drove the fork deep into his neck, the metallic tines biting through flesh with a sickening precision. The sound that followed was not just a gasp, it was a chorus of horror that erupted from the passengers packed into the narrow cabin. Blood poured across Rowan's crisp uniform, darkening the blue fabric in uneven, spreading stains. He staggered sideways, his hands shooting up instinctively to clutch his throat, but the fork jutted grotesquely from the wound, a grim reminder of how quickly tables can turn. The aisle had become a stage, and every man, woman, and child aboard was trapped as a witness to this violent reversal. Ethan did not step back. His chest heaved, his muscles taut with rage, but his eyes, usually cool and calculating in boardrooms, were alight with something raw and primal. He pressed his free arm tighter around Oliver, whose frightened cries now mingled with the panicked murmurs of the crowd. The baby's blood still stained Ethan's sleeve, hot against his skin, feeding the fire in his veins. For one chilling second, the CEO was no longer a man of numbers and strategies. He was a father pushed beyond the edges of reason. Rowan's eyes bulged, glassy with pain, but even then there was no remorse in his expression. Instead, his lips twitched upward into something resembling a grin. He tried to speak, but his words came out as wet gurgles, each breath dragging blood across his teeth. Passengers leaned away, some covering their mouths, others gripping armrests in helpless terror. One man whispered, "My God," while another hissed, "He killed him." Yet Ethan did not hear them. His entire focus was on the man before him, the man who had dared to harm his child. "Look at me," Ethan growled, his voice low, trembling with fury. He shoved Rowan harder against the wall, pinning him there. "You thought he was defenseless? You thought you could use him to hurt me?" His words came out like blades, sharp and unrelenting. Rowan coughed violently in response, a spray of crimson spattering the cabin wall. Even through the choking, his eyes carried a glint of defiance as if he knew something Ethan did not. Ethan's mind, honed by years of corporate wars, cut through the haze of rage. Something about Rowan's composure unsettled him. This was not the panic of a man caught in his own cruelty. It was the look of someone who had accepted the role he was playing, someone who believed this moment was only a fragment of something larger. Ethan's grip faltered slightly as the realization slithered into his thoughts. Behind him, passengers shifted, torn between fear of Rowan and fear of Ethan himself. The sight of a CEO, polished suit torn, face set like stone, fork dripping with another man's blood, was as terrifying as the act that started it all. A young male passenger, trembling in his seat, whispered to the man beside him, "He saved the kid, but what if he snaps further?" Their hushed tones carried through the cabin, feeding the storm of tension. Ethan could sense it, the weight of judgment pressing against his shoulders, but he refused to let go. "You're not just a bully," Ethan muttered, tightening his hold. "There's something else. You knew what you were doing the moment you stepped down this aisle." He searched Rowan's face, hunting for answers, but Rowan only let out a guttural laugh, broken by the fluid clogging his throat. The sound was more chilling than any scream, a signal that he still believed he held power, even as life ebbed from him. The engines hummed steadily above, the lights flickered slightly from the earlier turbulence, and the confined cabin seemed to shrink. Every second stretched into an eternity. Ethan could feel Oliver trembling in his arm, the baby's small breaths uneven against his chest. That tremble, that fear, pushed him to drive harder, not out of cruelty, but out of a father's desperate need to ensure that no one, ever again, would dare use his child as a pawn. Rowan tried to lift a hand toward Ethan, not in defense but in a gesture that seemed almost mocking, a bloodied finger pointing weakly at Oliver before falling limp. Ethan's eyes narrowed. The action made no sense, yet it carried weight. What did Rowan mean? Why focus on Oliver, even in his dying moments? A heavy silence settled for a heartbeat, broken only by the distant hum of the engines and Rowan's rasping breaths. Then Ethan's thoughts sharpened into something colder. He realized the fork was not just a weapon of revenge, it was a key, a turning point. Rowan's actions, his twisted smile, even the fork itself, they hinted at a truth deeper than the blood spilled on the floor. He pulled the fork free with a swift, decisive motion, and Rowan's body convulsed against the wall before sliding down into the aisle. Gasps swept through the cabin again, louder this time as crimson pooled around him. Passengers scrambled to lift their feet, some crying openly, others frozen in their seats. Ethan stood tall above the fallen man, the bloodied fork clenched tightly in his hand. His mind raced with questions, his heart thundered with rage, but beneath it all, a gnawing suspicion grew. Rowan's cruelty had not been random. There was something more, something that lurked beyond this single act of violence, and Ethan knew, whether he wanted to or not, that this was only the beginning. When justice strikes, it often tears away more than flesh. Rowan collapsed, clutching his throat, his fingers trembling as they pressed against the wound. The sharp gasp of passengers echoed through the cabin, a collective sound of disbelief and terror that hung in the recycled air like smoke. The sterile scent of the plane mixed with the metallic tang of blood, and for a moment it felt as though the entire aircraft was suspended in time, caught between silence and chaos. Ethan stood tall in the aisle, his chest heaving as he tightened his grip on Oliver, who whimpered softly against his father's shoulder. His eyes burned with fury, yet his mind was already calculating, searching for sense in the madness that had just unfolded. "Stay back!" Ethan's voice cut through the noise, commanding and sharp. The younger attendant, a boy barely older than 20, his face pale and drenched in sweat, had taken an uncertain step toward Rowan, his hands shaking as if pulled between duty and fear. Ethan's glare locked him in place. "Don't touch him." The words were cold, unyielding, like steel closing a door. The attendant froze, his mouth parting slightly as though he wanted to argue, but no words came. He retreated half a step, his eyes flicking nervously between Rowan's writhing form and the passengers staring wide-eyed from their seats. Rowan coughed violently, a wet, rattling sound that sprayed flecks of red across the polished aisle floor. His uniform, once pressed and pristine, was quickly being stained in dark blotches, spreading like ink through cloth. Yet his eyes, sharp, unblinking despite the haze of pain, locked onto Ethan with a strange defiance. His lips twisted upward into something between a grin and a grimace, and he forced a few words through the bubbling of blood in his throat. "You don't know." His voice was hoarse, broken, but carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around him. "Who's really pulling the strings?" The words struck Ethan harder than any weapon could. His jaw clenched, his heart thundering in his chest as his mind scrambled to grasp the meaning. Around them, passengers erupted into frightened whispers, voices overlapping in confusion and dread. "What does he mean?" one man in a business suit muttered, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles blanched white. "Is someone else involved?" another passenger whispered, his voice barely audible, yet sharp with panic. Ethan's eyes darted from face to face, scanning the cabin. Every expression was a mixture of fear, shock, and suspicion. Were they only passengers? Or had Rowan's words pointed to something hidden among them? Oliver's small whimper snapped Ethan's focus back to his son, and he adjusted the jacket wrapped around the child's injured hand. The fabric was already stained, but Ethan pressed it firmly, determined to protect him from both blood loss and fear. Rowan coughed again, his body convulsing against the floor, yet his gaze never left Ethan. There was no desperation in his eyes, no plea for mercy, only the unnerving satisfaction of a man who knew he had planted a seed of doubt. His smile, faint but deliberate, told Ethan that this violence was not the end but only the opening move of something larger. Ethan felt a cold realization creep into his mind. He had spent years navigating boardrooms where every word was a weapon and every silence a trap. This moment carried that same weight. Rowan was not acting alone. He had been a pawn, and someone, perhaps more than one person, had intended this chaos for a reason. The young attendant shifted uncomfortably, his lips trembling as he glanced toward the cockpit. "Shouldn't we call for the captain?" he asked softly, as though fearing the answer. His voice cracked under the pressure, betraying his youth. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "No one moves until I say." His tone was low but carried across the cabin, an anchor in the storm. He scanned the rows again, noticing passengers who avoided his gaze, others who leaned forward too intently, as though they were waiting for something. The atmosphere thickened with unease, every second stretching longer than the last. Rowan laughed weakly, the sound chilling in its frailty. Blood trickled down his chin as he whispered, "You think this is about me?" He coughed, the effort nearly doubling him over. "It's bigger. Far bigger." You'll see his words cracked, but their meaning was unmistakable. Ethan's grip on the fork tightened, its handle still slick. The instrument was no longer just a weapon, it had become a symbol of what was at stake. His instincts told him Rowan's cryptic warning was not a bluff. This was not random cruelty, nor was it a single man's malice. It was connected to something orchestrated, deliberate, and waiting to reveal itself. Passengers stirred uneasily, some whispering prayers, others holding tightly to loved ones. Every shuffle, every whisper added weight to the oppressive air. The faint hum of the engines seemed distant compared to the pounding in Ethan's ears. His mind turned, sharp and relentless, balancing fear with calculation. Could Rowan be signaling to someone else on this plane? Was another man already preparing to act? He knew he couldn't let his guard drop, not even for a heartbeat. Rowan's voice rasped one final time, dripping with pain but steeped in menace. His eyes locked on Ethan's, pupils sharp as if they carried secrets meant to haunt. The wound opened more than a vein. It opened a secret. The captain's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and urgent, carrying through the intercom with a calmness that felt too carefully crafted. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have the situation under control. Security will meet us upon landing." His tone was steady, rehearsed, as if plucked from a manual, but to Ethan Carraway it sounded like a mask. Behind those words he heard something else, a tremor, a hesitation, the faint outline of fear. Ethan did not sit back or relax. Instead, his jaw tightened and his eyes swept across the cabin like a hunter scanning the tree line for predators. Rowan's cryptic warning still rang in his ears, each word heavier than the last, clinging to him like a dark echo. You don't know who's really pulling the strings. It was not just a dying man's spite, it was a thread, and Ethan knew if he pulled hard enough it would unravel something larger than the assault itself. Oliver whimpered in his arms, his tiny hand wrapped in Ethan's jacket, blood still seeping through the fabric in stubborn drops. Ethan pressed his lips to the boy's forehead, whispering promises he barely believed himself. "I've got you. I'll protect you." His voice was steady, but his pulse was not. His mind, sharpened by years of corporate wars and hostile boardrooms, shifted from shock to strategy. Rowan's cruelty had been brutal, yes, but it was not random. It had meaning, purpose, and the true threat might not be Rowan at all. His gaze locked on the passengers. Most faces mirrored panic, wide eyes, trembling hands, shallow breaths. Mothers held their children tightly, businessmen hunched over in fear, younger men whispered hurried prayers. But among the chaos, two figures stood out like cracks in glass. Across the aisle sat a man in a gray blazer, calm as stone. While others fumbled with seatbelts or clutched armrests, he leaned back slightly, pen scratching across a small notebook balanced on his knee. His hand moved with precision, each stroke deliberate, as though he were not documenting panic but cataloging pieces of a puzzle. Every so often, his eyes flicked toward Ethan and Oliver, not with curiosity, but with measured interest, like a surgeon examining a patient before making the first cut. 2 rows down, another man sat rigid in seat 14C. He had not flinched once since the incident began. His posture was military straight, shoulders squared, eyes sharp and unwavering. While others breathed heavily, he appeared in control, almost expectant. And then Ethan saw it, the faintest curl at the corner of the man's mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the expression of someone who already knew how the next act would play out. Ethan's instincts burned. He had learned long ago to read men, to dissect their silence as much as their words. The calmness of these 2 men was not born of courage, it was born of foreknowledge. They knew something. They had expected this. He adjusted Oliver in his arms, the boy's soft cries muffled against his chest, and leaned slightly toward the gray blazer man. "Why are you writing?" Ethan asked, his voice low but firm, carrying only across the aisle. The man paused, the tip of his pen hovering just above the page. Without looking up, he replied in a voice so quiet Ethan almost missed it. "Observation." The word slipped out like smoke, cool and thin. "Observation of what?" Ethan pressed, his tone sharpening. The man's pen resumed its scratching. He finally lifted his gaze, eyes gray and glassy, revealing nothing. "Of movement. Of choices. Of outcomes," he murmured. His lips pulled into a slight smirk. "Some people run. Some people fight. You." His eyes dipped toward Oliver. "You protect." Ethan's stomach tightened. The words were not a compliment. They were an assessment. Before Ethan could respond, Rowan coughed from the floor, blood bubbling at the edge of his mouth, his hand pressed weakly against his neck wound. His laugh was a broken sound, but his words carried enough venom to strike. "You think stabbing me changes anything?" he croaked, his voice cracking. "You were marked long before boarding." The nearby passengers recoiled at his words, their fear thickening. Ethan's eyes burned into Rowan. "What do you mean?" he demanded, his voice edged with fury. But Rowan only smiled through his pain, as if enjoying the confusion, the growing web of uncertainty. Ethan's gaze snapped back to the rigid man in 14C, who had not moved even at Rowan's taunt. Their eyes locked, and for a long second, neither blinked. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man's lips parted, and he mouthed 2 words without sound. "Not yet." Ethan's breath hitched. Not yet. What did that mean? Not yet for help? Not yet for an attack? The ambiguity gnawed at him. A wave of cold realization struck him. Rowan's cruelty had been only the opening move, a violent spark to ignite something bigger. Ethan wasn't just reacting to a madman anymore. He was being measured, tested, drawn into a game he didn't know the rules of. And Oliver, his bleeding son, was at the center of it. Ethan adjusted his grip on the fork, still slick with blood, his knuckles whitening as he held Oliver tighter against his chest. The passengers' whispers surrounded him now, fearful currents pulling him in all directions. Hijacking? Conspiracy? Is it over? He ignored them all. His focus narrowed to the truth. This wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. And somewhere among these men, Rowan, the gray blazer, the rigid figure, was the strategist who had chosen him. Ethan's heart hardened as he understood what lay ahead. This was no longer about surviving the flight. It was about exposing the plan hidden beneath it, about pulling the strings tight enough to see who was holding them. Sometimes the real enemy isn't the one holding the weapon, but the one watching it being used. Ethan held Oliver close, his arm wrapped around the boy like an iron shield, while his jacket pressed tightly against the baby's bleeding hand. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the recycled air of the cabin, a bitter reminder that the attack had been no accident. His gaze flicked back and forth, never resting for more than a moment. Every face seemed sharper now, every whisper heavier with intent. Yet two figures drew him more than the rest. Rowan, crumpled and pale but still grinning through the crimson leaking from his neck, and the two men who had stayed far too composed during the chaos. The man in the gray blazer leaned forward, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He lowered his head as though to make a note, but instead of writing, he pressed his lips toward the tip of his pen and whispered into it. The sight was subtle, easily missed by the terrified passengers, but Ethan caught it. His chest tightened. That wasn't the nervous doodling of a bystander, it was reporting. His instincts screamed surveillance. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just watching. He was sending every detail somewhere unseen. Ethan shifted Oliver gently to his other arm, never breaking his watch on the gray blazer man. The hum of the engines filled the silence between gasps and nervous murmurs, but inside Ethan's mind, the noise was deafening. He had spent years navigating boardrooms where every glance, every hesitation, carried meaning. This was no different, only now the stakes weren't shares or contracts. They were lives. He narrowed his eyes, searching for a crack in the man's calm exterior, but the man only tilted his head, almost acknowledging Ethan's suspicion, as though daring him to act. Then came the other figure. Seat 14C, rigid, still. His posture almost militaristic, his gaze fixed directly on Ethan. There was no fear in him, no confusion like the rest of the passengers. Instead, he radiated control. The moment their eyes locked, the man's lips barely moved, shaping a single word. Ethan read it clearly. Not yet. The message struck like a blade between Ethan's ribs. Not yet? His mind scrambled. Not yet for what? An attack? A reveal? Or something larger, beyond the walls of this cabin? He tightened his grip on Oliver, the boy whimpering against his chest, and Ethan felt both fury and dread burn inside him. He wanted answers, but he also understood the danger of forcing them too soon. Timing mattered. He had built an empire on timing, and now timing might decide whether his son lived. Rowan's laugh broke through the tension, raw and wheezing. His pale face was twisted into a grotesque smirk, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "You think you've won anything?" he rasped. His voice was barely audible, yet it cut through the cabin like a knife. A few passengers flinched at the sound, while others clutched their armrests tighter. Ethan's jaw clenched, the urge to silence him rising, but he restrained himself. Rowan wanted a reaction. The younger attendant, the only one who had shown courage earlier, hovered a few rows back, his hands trembling. He looked to Ethan as though seeking guidance. Ethan gave a sharp shake of his head. Stay still. Stay quiet. In this new battlefield, rash moves could expose them all. The gray blazer man's pen clicked softly, once, then twice. His gaze swept across the cabin before settling on Rowan. The gesture felt like punctuation, as though marking a note in whatever report he was transmitting. Ethan's stomach churned. These men weren't improvising. They were following steps of a plan already written. Ethan's mind raced. If Rowan had been the opening act, then these men were the ones holding the script. He had no way of knowing how many others were in on it, the pilots, the attendants, maybe even passengers who seemed ordinary. Every face now carried suspicion. The claustrophobic walls of the cabin seemed to close in tighter, each row of seats becoming a barrier rather than shelter. "Tell me what you mean," Ethan demanded suddenly, his voice low but firm, addressing the man in 14C. "Not yet for what?" His words carried a CEO's authority, a tone sharpened by years of commanding boardrooms. The rigid man didn't waver. His stare stayed locked, his jaw unmoving. Only the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed acknowledgement. Then, slowly, he repeated the gesture, just the lips moving, shaping the same words. Not yet. The ambiguity cut deeper than a direct threat. It was a promise of something to come, and the certainty with which it was delivered filled Ethan with a gnawing unease. He realized with a chilling clarity that Rowan's fork attack had been more than cruelty. It had been a spark, a signal, perhaps even a test. Oliver stirred, his tiny cry muffled against Ethan's shirt. The sound grounded him, reminded him that hesitation could cost them everything. He pressed a kiss against his son's hair, his resolve hardening. He might not yet understand the full game being played, but he understood his role: protector, shield, father, and he would not be maneuvered like a pawn. The silence stretched, broken only by Rowan's ragged breathing and the hum of the engines. Every second carried weight, thick with dread, as though the entire cabin was holding its breath. Ethan's eyes swept once more between the gray blazer, the badge of composure in 14C, and the grinning, corpse-like figure of Rowan. He knew this wasn't random. It wasn't madness. It was control, and he was caught in its web. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had faced hostile takeovers, legal ambushes, and crises that could have destroyed his empire. This was no different, except that now, the cost wasn't fortune or reputation. It was his son's life. And with that realization, his fury cooled into focus. He would not break. He would not wait passively. He would read their moves, use their arrogance against them, and find a way to turn this impossible trap into his battlefield. But in that moment, one truth burned through him, heavy and undeniable. The fork had pierced flesh, but the real wound lay beneath the surface. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom, his words trembling even as he tried to sound calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning an emergency descent due to a medical situation. Please remain seated and keep calm." The announcement rippled through the cabin, but Ethan Carraway's eyes narrowed. Something was off. The captain's tone didn't carry the steady authority of a man in control. It carried rehearsal, as if he were repeating a line written by someone else. Ethan felt the vibration of unease in his chest, deeper than turbulence could cause. He tightened his grip on Oliver, who whimpered softly against his shoulder, his tiny injured hand wrapped in Ethan's jacket. The cries of the baby were drowned by murmurs spreading from row to row, whispers of hijacking, sabotage, terrorism. The atmosphere grew thick with dread, every passenger leaning into the next afraid to speak too loudly, afraid that the wrong word might make fear real. As Ethan shifted in his seat, the younger attendant approached with mechanical precision, carrying a small plastic cup of water. His hands trembled so visibly that droplets escaped the rim and stained his cuffs. His eyes, wide with fear, darted from Ethan to Rowan slumped in the aisle. With a subtle motion, he slid a folded napkin onto Ethan's arm as though it were nothing more than a gesture of politeness. Ethan accepted it with a nod, masking his suspicion. The attendant lingered for a moment, his lips parting as if he wanted to speak, but his courage faltered. He hurried back down the aisle, leaving Ethan alone with the napkin. Oliver stirred, letting out a faint whine, and Ethan kissed the top of his son's head before carefully unfolding the paper. Inside, written in rushed, uneven scrawls, were words that chilled him more than the captain's trembling voice. They planned this before takeoff. Trust no one in uniform. Ethan's chest tightened. His breath came slow and heavy as though the air itself had thickened around him. He turned the words over in his mind, weighing every possibility. If the note was true, then Rowan's attack had never been about cruelty alone. It had been a signal, a first move in a sequence. Ethan's objective shifted in that moment, sharpening into a single blade of purpose: protect Oliver, uncover the truth, and tear apart the deception strangling this flight. He lifted his eyes, scanning the cabin with the precision of a man used to boardrooms where every glance, every silence carried hidden meaning. Several passengers huddled together, whispering prayers. Others sat frozen, clutching armrests. But a few, just a few, seemed too composed. Their expressions weren't fear, but anticipation. At the front, the older attendant with thinning hair stood stiffly, his eyes fixed not on the passengers but on the cockpit door, as though waiting for a cue. In the middle rows, the man in the gray blazer was still scribbling in his notebook, his pen gliding calmly while chaos spread like fire around him. His lips moved faintly, muttering words Ethan couldn't hear, but the cadence was unnatural, like dictation rather than nervous notes. And then there was the rigid man in 14C. He sat upright, shoulders square, eyes never leaving Ethan. Not once did he blink at the baby's cries or the blood-stained jacket. Instead, his stare was deliberate, cold, almost military. When Ethan finally locked eyes with him, the man's lips formed a single word without sound. Not yet. The phrase struck Ethan like a stone in the chest. Not yet. What was being timed? His pulse hammered in his temples as he replayed the captain's announcement. The trembling voice, the rehearsed tone. If Rowan wasn't acting alone, then perhaps the captain wasn't truly in command. The napkin crumpled in Ethan's fist, its warning etched into his mind. Trust no one in uniform. That meant the attendants. That meant the cockpit. That meant, perhaps, the very man who had just promised to land them safely. Oliver whimpered again, and Ethan rocked him gently, though his own hands were far from steady. The child's pain fueled his resolve. He bent close to his son, whispering so softly that only Oliver could hear. "I won't let them take you. Not now. Not ever." His voice shook with suppressed rage, but also with clarity. Every decision he made now would decide not only their fate, but the fate of everyone trapped inside this pressurized cage of lies. The cabin jolted suddenly, the descent beginning in earnest. Oxygen masks rattled above their heads, some nearly falling free. A woman cried out, clutching her husband's arm, but Ethan remained still, calculating. He thought about the captain's words again, about the allies Rowan had hinted at before choking on his own blood. It all connected, puzzle pieces slamming together mid-air. The young attendant caught his gaze from the galley. His face was pale, drenched in sweat, but he gave Ethan the smallest nod as if to confirm the note was real. Ethan recognized the courage behind that gesture, a silent vow of loyalty despite the danger. It told him one thing clearly. Rowan's attack had been more than cruelty. It had been a signal. The fork wound had opened more than flesh. It had opened a secret. Ethan sat straighter, his body a coil of tension ready to strike, every sense heightened by the knowledge that betrayal was all around him. And as the engines roared and the descent grew steeper, he understood with chilling certainty. The truth was no longer about survival, but about betrayal at 30,000 feet. He thought blood on the seats would be forgotten, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The man in the gray blazer did not look up at first, his pen scratching across the small notebook in his lap, as if the chaos of the cabin were no more than background noise. Ethan shifted Oliver carefully, balancing his son against his shoulder so the child's injured hand remained pressed beneath the fold of his jacket. His voice was steady, low, but edged with the weight of command. "You've been writing since it started. Who are you?" The pen stopped mid-stroke. Slowly, the man lifted his eyes, a half-smile forming on his lips, faint and deliberate, as though every expression was part of some performance only he understood. His voice, when it came, was calm and unhurried, carrying neither apology nor explanation. "Observer," he said quietly, his eyes glinting in the dim cabin light. "Not actor." "But actors bleed." Ethan bristled at the words. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his arm flexing as he instinctively tightened his hold on Oliver. He had no patience for riddles. His son's life demanded clarity, not cryptic games. Yet the man in the gray blazer leaned back slightly, as though enjoying the rising tension, his pen tapping once against the notebook before falling still. Rowan slumped against the aisle wall, coughed wetly, his breath rattling with each shallow inhale. The blood at his throat had slowed to a sticky seep, but his eyes still burned with a feverish light. With a sudden broken laugh that cracked like glass, he drew the cabin's attention once more. "You think stabbing me changes anything?" he rasped, the words thick and gurgling, yet sharp enough to cut through the noise of panicked whispers. His lips curled into a twisted grin as he spat a final truth into the air. "You were marked long before boarding." Passengers recoiled visibly, some gasping aloud, others muttering frantic questions. One man demanded, "What does he mean?" "Marked?" While another hissed at Rowan to be quiet, but Rowan only chuckled again, the sound raw and grating, his body trembling from the effort. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. Marked. The word clung to his thoughts like a dark stain, heavy with implication. He looked around the cabin, scanning the passengers. Too many eyes seemed to flick toward him, some fearful, others suspicious, a few oddly calm, as if waiting. He could feel judgment in every gaze, but also something more unsettling. Expectation. He lowered his eyes to Oliver, who whimpered softly, his tiny face pressed against Ethan's collar. The child's wounded hand had left a faint crimson streak across the CEO's jacket, a visible reminder of how quickly innocence could be shattered. Ethan's throat tightened. He could not, would not, Allow his son to become a pawn in whatever twisted game was unfolding here. His hand shifted, fingers brushing against the handle of the fork still clenched tight. The metal was slick, its edge stained by both his son's blood and Rowan's. Once it had been an ordinary utensil. Now it felt heavier, charged with meaning far beyond its design. Ethan's mind, sharpened by years of ruthless negotiations and hostile boardrooms, began to frame it differently. The fork was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol, a key to unraveling whatever shadowed puzzle Rowan had hinted at. Rowan's eyes gleamed faintly as if reading Ethan's thoughts. He coughed again, weak but defiant, his whisper reaching only those close enough to hear. "The storm hasn't broken yet." The words chilled Ethan, though he forced his face into a mask of control. He turned back to the gray blazer man whose faint smirk had not faded. The observer watched the scene with clinical detachment, every movement noted, every reaction measured. Ethan realized that no matter what he did, every choice was being recorded, transformed into data for someone else's eyes. "Enough games," Ethan growled under his breath, though not loudly enough to draw every ear in the cabin. His glare locked onto the man with the notebook. "If you're just watching, then you know something I don't. Tell me why." The man merely shook his head, his pen poised once more above the page. "Not my role," he murmured. "But yours?" "Yours has already begun." Ethan's chest burned with frustration, but before he could press further, Oliver shifted in his arms, letting out a sharp cry that echoed through the tense silence. It pulled every gaze back to them. Every set of eyes reminded once more that the smallest passenger was also the center of this storm. Ethan rocked his son gently, whispering reassurances, even as his mind burned with calculation. He felt the weight of the fork again, heavier with each heartbeat. Rowan's words replayed in his mind, marked long before boarding. The blood on his son's hand was not only evidence of cruelty, it was proof that this moment had been set in motion long before Ethan had stepped onto the plane. His instincts told him the fork was not the end, but the beginning, a bloody token that would force the truth to bleed out, drop by drop. The truth had begun to bleed out, drop by drop. The rigid man in 14C finally rose, and the air inside the cabin shifted instantly as though the oxygen itself tightened. Every pair of eyes turned to him, their fear momentarily diverted from Rowan's crumpled form to this stranger whose movements carried a calculated precision. His shoulders squared as he stepped into the aisle, the faint hum of the engines underscoring his deliberate pace. There was no hesitation, no nervous glance, only the steady resolve of a man who had trained for moments like this. Ethan's muscles tensed. His instincts screamed that this was no ordinary passenger. Cradling Oliver close, he braced for violence, expecting the man to draw a weapon. But instead, the stranger stopped a few feet away and pulled back his jacket. Gasps rippled through the rows as a badge gleamed under the dim cabin lights, an emblem unknown to most, its edges sharp, its symbol unrecognizable. It was not the crest of a government agency or the seal of any authority passengers could name, and that uncertainty made it more chilling. The emblem seemed to declare both power and secrecy. "You were never supposed to intervene," the man said, his voice low but carrying through the tense silence. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked on Ethan with the weight of command. Ethan's grip on his son tightened, anger flushing his face. His voice cracked through the air, fierce and raw. "He's a child." His words trembled with rage, and every syllable carried the sharp edge of a father's fury. The man did not blink. He stood like stone, unshaken by the outburst. Slowly he tilted his head, his expression void of sympathy. "A symbol," he corrected, his tone cold, clinical, as though he were explaining a fact of physics rather than speaking of an infant. "Nothing more." The declaration struck Ethan harder than the turbulence shaking the plane. The fork wound on Oliver's hand throbbed beneath the makeshift bandage, and the baby whimpered softly, unaware of the storm unraveling around him. For Ethan, the meaning was unbearable. His son had not been harmed for cruelty or mistake. He had been used, deliberately chosen as a lever to push Ethan into action. The cabin fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of engines and Oliver's weak cries. Passengers whispered nervously, their faces pale with confusion. They did not understand the language of symbols and levers, but they understood fear. Ethan's mind raced. A CAO's mind sharpened by years of strategy now twisted into survival instinct. Every boardroom war, every hostile negotiation he had ever fought now seemed a faint rehearsal for this moment. His heart thundered as realization clawed at him. His choices had been predicted, his anger provoked, his moves anticipated. He was not playing the game. He was the game. Rowan, slumped against the wall, coughed a weak laugh, blood seeping from his neck. His gaze flickered between Ethan and the badge holder, his expression mocking despite the crimson stains on his lips. The sound made Ethan's stomach churn. Even in his broken state, Rowan seemed to know more, to relish the confusion that kept Ethan trapped. The badge holder took another step forward, his boots echoing softly against the narrow aisle. "You were meant to stay seated," he said, his tone calm as though lecturing a defiant pupil. "You were meant to obey." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Now, the entire balance is shifting, and it is your fault." Ethan's jaw clenched. He wanted to lunge, to strike, but the weight of Oliver in his arms anchored him. He knew one reckless move could shatter the fragile line between survival and catastrophe. He could feel passengers' eyes on him, waiting for his response as though he carried not just his child's fate but theirs as well. A man in the back row muttered a prayer under his breath. Another clutched his wife's hand tightly. The entire cabin seemed frozen in a tableau of fear, the hum of the aircraft the only steady rhythm against the rising heartbeat of suspense. Ethan searched for words, for leverage, for anything that could break the hold this man claimed over him, but all he saw was Oliver's tiny face, pressed against his chest, trusting him with a faith too pure for such a world. The truth cut into him deeper than any blade could. This was not random. His son was never the true victim. He was the bait, the trigger, the symbol chosen to ignite Ethan's fury. And as the badge holder's words sank deeper, Ethan felt the invisible chains tightening around him, binding him to a role he had never chosen but could not refuse. His every instinct screamed to resist, to fight, to defy the path others had drawn for him. Yet the revelation hung heavy, reshaping the battlefield he thought he understood. Now, every step he had taken since boarding, every desperate action, every drop of blood, felt orchestrated, manipulated, controlled. And that knowledge burned more fiercely than the rage still coursing through his veins. When a child becomes a symbol, a father becomes a weapon. The plane jolted again, but this time not from turbulence. A deep metallic groan reverberated through the fuselage, echoing like the strained breath of a machine pushed beyond its will. Overhead, compartments rattled violently, and a few oxygen masks swayed free from their panels, dangling like silent witnesses. Passengers clutched their armrests, eyes darting around in fear, but Ethan's focus sharpened on the sound. It wasn't random. It was mechanical, a deliberate override, as though unseen hands had reached into the veins of the aircraft and seized control. Ethan's suspicion hardened into certainty. Rowan's cruel attack on Oliver hadn't been an isolated act of madness. It was a spark, meant to ignite panic, to fracture order. But the real threat lay deeper, hidden in the very systems keeping them in the sky. The thought tightened around Ethan's chest like a vice. The plane was no longer theirs. Beside him, the young attendant leaned close, his voice a fragile whisper drowned by the hum of the engines. "Sir, communications are down. Nothing's going out. We're cut off." His trembling hands clutched a folded piece of paper, then shoved it back into his pocket as though even holding it was dangerous. Ethan's jaw clenched. Isolation. Whoever orchestrated this had ensured that no distress call would escape. The world below would believe this flight was routine, unaware of the silent war unfolding above the clouds. He shifted Oliver in his arm, pulling the baby closer to his chest. The child whimpered faintly, his tiny bandaged hand pressing weakly against his father's shirt. Ethan kissed the boy's temple, his mind already racing. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer closed his notebook with deliberate calm. The faint snap of the cover carried more weight than any shout. It was the sound of completion. His role, whatever it had been, was finished. He leaned back, folding his hands neatly, a faint smile tugging at his lips as though satisfied with the chaos swirling around them. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What are you smiling at?" he demanded in a low voice, his tone sharp with suspicion. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I only watch," he murmured, voice smooth, distant. "What's meant to unfold unfolds." His calmness unsettled Ethan more than Rowan's malice ever had. This wasn't panic. It was expectation. A movement at the front of the cabin snapped Ethan's attention away. The rigid man in seat 14C rose with precision, every motion controlled, measured. Without hesitation, he adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the cockpit. For the first time, the symbol on his chest was revealed fully, an unfamiliar badge, its emblem glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Passengers gasped, murmurs swelling like an incoming tide. Ethan stepped forward, blocking his path. "Where are you going?" The man's expression was cold, carved from stone. "To ensure order," he replied flatly. His eyes flicked toward Oliver, then back to Ethan, carrying a weight that chilled the air. Ethan felt a surge of fury, but beneath it, strategy whispered. He had spent years maneuvering against corporate predators, reading their tactics, turning their pressure against them. This was no different, only the stakes were lives, not profits. Timing, pressure, leverage. He repeated the mantra silently, grounding himself. The badge holder didn't flinch. He gave a subtle signal with 2 fingers toward the cockpit door. The faint click of a lock disengaging answered him. Ethan's stomach dropped. They already had access. He gripped the bloodied fork tighter, feeling its weight like a reminder of both desperation and defiance. "You'll go through me first," he growled. Passengers leaned in, fear battling with hope in their eyes. A few men murmured prayers under their breath. Others pulled their children close, shielding them from the sight. The entire cabin had become a stage, every breath heavy with anticipation. The badge holder's voice lowered, almost calm. "You don't understand what you're standing in the way of." Ethan met his gaze unflinchingly. "Try me." For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the groan of the engines and Oliver's soft whimper. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered. The plane shuddered violently, and overhead, alarms blinked faintly before cutting out again. It was proof. Someone had seized the plane's vanes, and they were tightening the grip. The young attendant staggered forward, his voice cracking. "They're overriding the systems. We're losing control." Ethan's mind sharpened. Rowan had been the knife. The badge holder was the enforcer, and the true mastermind was somewhere unseen, already inside the aircraft's heart. He glanced at the gray blazer man who still watched, lips moving faintly as though narrating to invisible ears. Ethan realized then, he was no longer just defending Oliver. He was standing between every passenger and a coordinated plot that had already sunk its claws into the plane. His pulse quickened, but his mind remained steady. A battlefield, he thought. Every field had its rules, every enemy, its weakness. He tightened his grip on Oliver, holding him close as though shielding him with his very heartbeat. Then, with a grim calm, he began piecing the chaos into order, turning fear into focus, passengers into pawns, and himself into the strategist the enemy had not expected. In the heart of disorder, a strategist finds his war. The engines roared with a force that rattled every seat, a low mechanical growl that filled the cabin and pressed against the passengers' ears. The plane shuddered as it descended sharply, oxygen masks swaying above like pendulums caught in a storm. Panic surged through the rows in hushed sobs and hurried whispers, but in the aisle, tension boiled into a single line of conflict. Ethan Carraway stood tall, one arm clutching Oliver against his chest, the other stretched outward to block the path of the badge holder marching toward the cockpit. "Not another step," Ethan growled, his voice carrying the weight of a father's fury and the authority of a man who had commanded boardrooms. His glare burned into the badge holder's cold eyes. The man's steps faltered for the first time, but his face remained stone, his jaw locked with unshaken resolve. Around them, passengers leaned forward, unable to look away. The cabin seemed smaller, tighter, as though every breath of air was being swallowed by the confrontation. The badge holder's lips parted slightly, his tone flat but laced with quiet menace. "You're standing in the way of something you cannot control." His hand hovered near his jacket, not drawing a weapon but hinting at unseen power, as though the badge itself was enough to silence resistance. His stare never left Ethan, his body still as marble, every movement calculated to intimidate. Oliver whimpered in Ethan's arms, the soft cry cutting through the heavy silence like glass cracking in a frozen lake. Ethan bent his head slightly, whispering reassurance to his son, but his gaze never left the man before him. His pulse hammered, yet his mind sharpened, threading every detail together. Rowan's cryptic words, the gray blazer's calm detachment, the pilot's trembling voice. This was not chance, it was design, and the design was closing in. From the rear, Rowan's broken cough tore through the standoff. Passengers twisted in their seats, startled as the wounded attendant slumped forward, blood glistening at the corner of his lips. He raised a trembling hand, his fingers twitching against the air like a dying conductor. The sound he forced out was weak, strangled yet unmistakable, a laugh, wet with blood. Ethan's chest tightened as Rowan's eyes locked on him, wild and knowing. "The landing isn't for you," Rowan hissed between gurgles, every word dragging a line of red from his throat. "It's for them." The cabin froze. Passengers whispered sharply, their fear blooming into terror as the meaning of those words hung in the stale, recycled air. Ethan's gut twisted. The words didn't belong to a dying man. They belonged to someone who had seen the plan in its entirety and wanted Ethan to know he was only scratching the surface. Ethan's gaze darted to the windows, where the outside world blurred into streaks of cloud and gray. His thoughts raced. If Rowan was right, then the emergency descent was no rescue at all. It was delivery. Whatever waited on the ground wasn't help. It was an ambush. He could almost see it in his mind's eye. Shadowed figures in the mist, weapons raised, not for the passengers but for him, for Oliver. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his son. The badge holder stepped closer, his tone sharper now, as though Rowan's words had pricked even his stoic mask. "Stand aside," he ordered. The authority in his voice was deliberate, rehearsed, like a man who had spent years commanding obedience. But Ethan was unmoved. "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice low and steady. His stance widened, his frame blocking the narrow aisle. Every muscle in his body braced, not just against the man before him, but against the truth Rowan had just unveiled. He could feel eyes on him from all directions, passengers hoping, fearing, waiting for him to act. The gray blazer man reclined further into his seat, one leg crossed over the other, his fingers drumming casually on the armrest. His calm smile was almost mocking, as if he had been expecting every twist, every reaction. Ethan caught his eye and saw not amusement, but calculation, like a man taking notes on a play already written. Ethan's mind burned with urgency. He thought of Oliver's tiny hand, bandaged but trembling, a reminder of the cruelty that had begun this spiral. He thought of his responsibility, not just as a CEO, not just as a father, but as the only man willing to stand between these forces and the innocent lives crammed into the cabin. The descent might take them to the ground, but Ethan now understood. The real danger had only just begun. The engines screamed louder, the floor vibrating beneath his shoes, and the cabin lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. Every sound, every movement carried the weight of finality. Ethan kissed Oliver's forehead gently, his lips pressing against warm skin dampened by tears. His vow was silent but unyielding. He would not let this plane or anyone waiting below take his child. Rowan slumped further, his laughter breaking into a rattling cough, and the badge holder clenched his jaw, preparing to push forward. Ethan braced himself, his heart pounding with the rhythm of war drums, knowing the battle was far from over. For the first time, Ethan realized the battle wasn't ending with landing. It was only beginning. Sometimes the ground is more dangerous than the sky. The plane touched down with a screech of tires, the cabin jolting as if the metal bird had been yanked from the sky and forced onto the earth. Mist clung thick to the windows, curling in pale veils that blurred the outline of the airfield. It wasn't the bright city skyline passengers had expected, but a shadowed strip of tarmac surrounded by hulking hangars and the dark silhouettes of waiting figures. A ripple of panic coursed through the rows of seats as voices rose, questions, prayers, cries that went unanswered. Ethan's gaze sharpened, cutting through the fog of fear as he pressed Oliver firmly against his chest. The baby whimpered softly, his tiny bandaged hand twitching against his father's shirt. Ethan's jaw locked as his mind assessed the scene. Men in dark uniforms standing still, too still, as though rehearsed. Their rifles glinted faintly through the mist. This wasn't a rescue team. This was a collection. Beside him, the badge holder moved with calm authority, his face a mask of cold efficiency. He leaned close enough for Ethan to catch the faint smell of iron on his clothes. "Step aside," the man said, his voice even but commanding. His eyes, pale and unwavering, flicked to Oliver. "You're not the mission." Ethan's grip on the fork tightened, the jagged tines pressing into his palm until he felt the sting of pain. The same fork that had drawn blood from both his son and Rowan had now become his anchor, a symbol of defiance. His thoughts raced, not just about survival, but about strategy. Every decision would carry consequences not only for him, but for every soul on board. He turned slightly toward the trembling young attendant, whose face was pale beneath the dim cabin lights. Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper, low and sharp like steel drawn from a sheath. "Help me block the exit. Don't let them take him." The boy's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, but his eyes found a spark of courage. He nodded, fingers tightening around the trolley he had used earlier as cover. His body trembled, but his stance firmed, shoulders squaring as though he had been waiting his whole life to defy orders. A hiss shattered the moment. The cabin door unlocked, hydraulics groaning as it began to widen. Cold mist poured in, curling into the narrow aisle like the breath of some lurking beast. Passengers shrank back instinctively, eyes darting toward the widening gap that promised either safety or damnation. The first boot stepped inside, black leather, polished but heavy, followed by another. A man emerged, tall and broad, his rifle slung across his chest. His expression was unreadable, hidden behind the shadow of his cap. He scanned the cabin as if cataloging faces, but his focus lingered on Ethan. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but his thoughts were cold, deliberate. He angled his body, shielding Oliver completely while keeping the fork raised just enough to be seen. Every muscle in his body screamed to strike, yet he held back, knowing that one premature move could unleash the storm too soon. The armed figure advanced a step further, the mist curling around his legs like smoke rising from a battlefield. Behind him, more shadows shifted in the fog, their outlines suggesting numbers too great to fight outright. Dramatic irony pressed on Ethan's chest. The passengers believed the worst had passed with the landing, but he knew this was only the beginning. The badge holder moved toward the door with a soldier's stride, signaling to the intruders with a subtle nod. Ethan blocked his path, shoulders squared, his voice a low growl. "Not another step?" The intruder paused, his eyes narrowing. Tension crackled in the air like a live wire, every passenger holding their breath as though a single exhale might ignite the violence simmering in the cabin. Ethan's mind replayed Rowan's dying words, that haunting warning about strings being pulled from elsewhere. Whoever these men were, they weren't here by chance. Oliver stirred in his arms, his tiny cry slicing through the silence like glass. The sound grounded Ethan, reminded him why he stood defiant in the face of impossible odds. His resolve hardened, his will unshakable. The door slid fully open with a hiss, metal grinding against metal, and the mist spilled deeper inside, cloaking the aisle in a cold shroud. Ethan's knuckles whitened around the fork. His eyes locked on the intruder's weapon, then shifted to the young attendant gripping the trolley with trembling arms. Every second stretched, drawn taut like a bowstring ready to snap. The intruder's lips curled into a faint smirk, as though he already knew the outcome. But Ethan refused to yield. He leaned close to Oliver's ear, whispering words meant only for his son, words of promise and fire. Then he raised his voice, loud enough for all to hear, his tone steady and defiant. "You will not take him." The armed man's boot pressed forward another inch, breaking the invisible boundary Ethan had drawn. The world seemed to tilt, the air heavy with the weight of choices not yet made. Passengers clutched the armrests, eyes darting between father and intruder, knowing that one heartbeat would decide everything. And in that breathless pause, with the mist curling around them and fate looming at the threshold, the truth became undeniable. This was not rescue. This was capture. The game had shifted from survival to defiance. The door hissed wider, echoing through the cabin like the toll of a distant bell. The first intruder stepped fully inside. When the door opens, fate steps through. Chaos ignited instantly. The sound of the cabin door unlocking had barely echoed before Ethan lunged forward, his entire body coiled with the fury of a father cornered. He struck the first intruder with the blunt end of the fork, the impact cracking against the man's temple with a sickening thud. The intruder staggered back, clutching his head, while passengers screamed in unison, their cries rippling through the narrow cabin like waves crashing against steel. The scent of sweat, fear, and the faint tang of spilled blood filled the air, thick enough to choke on. Beside Ethan, the young attendant, his hands trembling but his resolve iron, heaved a service trolley across the aisle with desperate strength. The heavy metal cart clanged as it slammed into position, blocking the narrow passageway and pinning two of the armed figures back against the galley. One of them cursed under his breath, struggling to push the barrier aside while the other fumbled to regain balance. The space was suddenly a battlefield, every corner alive with tension, every heartbeat louder than the plane's engines. The badge holder, taller and broader than Ethan, surged forward with military precision, eyes cold, movements deliberate. His arm clamped around Ethan's wrist, trying to wrench the fork free. "Stand down," he barked, his voice sharp, commanding, and devoid of hesitation. Ethan met his stare, his face inches away, and for a moment their eyes locked like two blades clashing mid-strike. His son's soft whimper reached his ears, piercing through the noise and igniting a fire that roared louder than fear. With the instinct of a man who had survived boardrooms where power was another form of war, Ethan shifted his weight suddenly, twisting his arm in a sharp arc. He forced the badge holder back, driving him into a row of seats. The metal frames groaned as the man's body collided with them, passengers shrinking into corners, shielding themselves with trembling hands. Ethan snarled through clenched teeth, his voice raw with rage and desperation. "You will not take my son." His grip tightened on the fork, his knuckles white, his body trembling with both exhaustion and feral determination. The cabin vibrated with overlapping sounds, shouts, cries, the screech of the trolley being shoved, the thud of bodies struggling in confined space. Yet through it all, a single voice cut sharply, smooth and unnervingly calm. The man in the gray blazer had not moved to fight, nor to flee. He stood centered in the aisle, the faint glow of the overhead lights casting long shadows across his sharp features. His eyes glimmered with something unreadable as he lifted a small device no larger than a pen, its lens blinking faintly red. His voice was low, steady, and oddly reverent, like a historian recording the final lines of a prophecy. "The father becomes fire when the child is threatened," he murmured, each syllable deliberate, almost ceremonial. Ethan's head snapped toward him, fury twisting his features. For a fleeting second, he wanted to silence the man's voice with the same fork that dripped faint traces of blood in his hand. But he hesitated, because in that tone there was no malice, only observation. It was as though the man was not an enemy, but a witness, documenting every moment of this chaos with eerie detachment. His expression remained unchanged, lips curved in a faint smile as though he were savoring the unraveling of a script only he understood. The realization hit Ethan with a chill sharper than the air conditioning blasting through the vents. The gray blazer man wasn't commanding these intruders, nor was he fighting alongside them. He was watching, recording, ensuring that every scream, every strike, every desperate word was preserved. For whom? Ethan didn't know, but the knowledge gnawed at him. He was not just fighting for his son's survival. He was being written into a narrative designed by unseen hands. The badge holder grunted, shoving against him, forcing Ethan to redirect his attention. The struggle tightened, muscles straining, breaths colliding in harsh bursts. But Ethan's mind, sharp and unyielding, refused to bend. His son's cries were softer now, muffled in his jacket, yet they anchored him with brutal clarity. He tightened his stance, angled his shoulder, and drove forward again, the strength of desperation lending him more power than he thought possible. Around them, passengers huddled, some sobbing, some praying, others frozen in wide-eyed disbelief. The young attendant, still pressing his weight against the trolley, glanced at Ethan with fear and awe, as if realizing in that moment that the man before him was not only a father but a storm, refusing to be contained. The gray blazer man's voice returned, quieter now, almost like a whisper meant for someone far beyond the cabin walls. His eyes gleamed as the red light on his device pulsed. The truth was being written in blood and breath. Ethan forced the attackers back with the raw strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. The cabin shook with the chaos of bodies clashing, metal rattling and passengers crying out, but his focus was sharp as steel. His chest rose and fell heavily, Oliver pressed tightly against him, the baby's small hand trembling beneath layers of cloth hastily tied around the wound. The attackers stumbled into the aisle, caught off guard by Ethan's surge, and in that brief moment of hesitation he seized control. "Block the doors!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the panic like a command in a boardroom. Except this was no meeting. It was survival. The terrified passengers, their eyes wide with desperation, responded almost instinctively. They shoved luggage against the doors, locked arms, and braced themselves against the weight of fear pressing from both inside and out. Sirens blared outside, muffled by the thick metal walls of the aircraft, but their meaning was unmistakable. Help could be on the way, or perhaps more enemies, another layer to this orchestrated nightmare. Ethan could feel the vibration of boots against the tarmac, like distant thunder promising a storm that had not yet broken. His voice trembled as he whispered, "You turned their trap into their failure." His wide eyes reflected both fear and awe, as though he had just witnessed an impossible reversal. Ethan's grip tightened on Oliver, his jaw set. The boy's whimpers gnawed at his heart, but the fire in his veins left no room for hesitation. From across the cabin, the gray blazer man rose slowly, deliberately, as though the chaos around him was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He closed his device with a soft snap and tucked it away, his movements measured, practiced. For the first time, the carefully constructed smile that had lingered on his lips since the beginning dissolved. He looked at Ethan with a gaze that carried something between disdain and reluctant respect. "This was not supposed to end with you standing," he admitted, his voice calm but edged with grudging frustration. The words carried weight, as though they were not his own but part of a larger truth. Ethan turned sharply, his eyes locked on the man. His face was streaked with sweat, his knuckles bloodied from the struggle, yet his posture radiated unbroken defiance. "I don't break for anyone," he said, his tone cold, each word a hammer blow that silenced the murmurs around them. The passengers, some crouched in fear, others standing rigidly as barricades, turned their eyes toward Ethan. Relief flickered in their faces like fragile sparks in the dark, the realization dawning that he had become their shield, their anchor in the storm. The tension thickened as footsteps echoed outside the aircraft, growing louder, closer. The barricade rattled slightly as the external force tested the sealed doors, a reminder that the fight was far from over. But inside, for this fleeting moment, Ethan had carved a space of control. He shifted Oliver gently, pressing the boy's bandaged hand against his chest, whispering softly into his son's hair, words only the child could hear. His mind, however, was already racing, weighing possibilities, preparing for the next move. Every instinct told him this victory was fragile, that the silence outside carried a promise of something worse to come. The gray blazer man remained standing, unmoving, his eyes never leaving Ethan. There was no longer any mask of amusement, only a quiet recognition that the rules had shifted. The man's presence itself was a foreshadowing, a sign that unseen powers still lingered, waiting for the right moment to act. Ethan knew this was only the beginning, but he also knew one truth burned brighter than all the shadows around him. He had proven he would fight, no matter the cost. The passengers erupted in cheers, their voices shaky but rising in unison, filling the cabin with the sound of fragile hope. The air vibrated with defiance, each shout a small rebellion against the terror that had tried to claim them. Ethan stood tall in the center of it all. Oliver held close, his heart pounding with the rhythm of determination. The battle outside would come, but for now he had won something more powerful than safety. He had won belief. The air itself seemed to change, heavy, not with fear, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the game had shifted. The gray blazer man's eyes narrowed, his silence an admission of defeat he would not voice. Ethan met his gaze, unflinching, the fork still clutched in his hand as both weapon and symbol. "I don't break for anyone," he repeated in his mind, knowing that statement now belonged to every soul on the plane. And as the sound of cheers echoed through the battered cabin, a single truth crystallized in the air, undeniable and absolute. This wasn't just survival, it was defiance. And though the battle wasn't over, Ethan had changed the rules. When a father bleeds for his son, even the sky must bow. Seconds later, the father struck back. The same fork became the attendant's downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and retaliation against unchecked abuse of authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought about accountability in positions of power, and inspire action toward dignity, justice, and reform.